Chapter 5 of Lord Tony's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lilaread. Book 2, Chapter 5 of Lord Tony's Wife by Baroness ORCZY. After Martin Roget and Chauvelin had left her, Yvonne had sat for a long time motionless, almost unconscious. It seems as if gradually, hour by hour, minute by minute, her every feeling of courage and of hope were deserting her. 3 days now she had been separated from her father. 3 days she had been under the constant supervision of a woman who had not a single thought of compassion or of mercy for the aristocrat whom she hated so bitterly. At night, curled up on the small bundle of dank straw, Yvonne had made vain efforts to snatch a little sleep. Ever since the day when she had been ruthlessly torn away from the protection of a dear milord, she had persistently clung to the belief that he would find the means to come to her, to wrest her from the cruel fate which her pitiless enemies had devised for her. She had clung to that hope through that dreary journey from dear England to this abominable city. She had clung to it even whilst her father knelt at her feet in an agony of remorse. She had clung to hope while Martin Roget alternately coaxed and terrorized her, while her father was dragged away from her, while she endured untold misery, starvation, humiliation at the hands of Louise Adet. But now, quite unaccountably, that hope seemed suddenly to have fled from her, leaving her lonely and inexpressibly desolate. That small, shrunken figure which, wrapped in a dark mantle, had stood in the corner of the room watching her like a serpent watches its prey, had seemed like the forerunner of the fate which Martin Roget, gloating over her helplessness, had already threatened her. She knew, of course, that neither from him, nor from the callous brute who governed Nantes, could she expect the slightest justice or mercy. She had been brought here by Martin Roget not only to die, but to suffer grievously at his hands in return for a crime which she personally was in no way responsible. To hope for mercy from him at the 11th hour was worse than futile. Her already overburdened heart ached at the thought of her father. He suffered all that she suffered, and in addition he must be tortured with anxiety for her and with remorse. Sometimes she was afraid that under the stress of desperate soul agony he might perhaps have been led to suicide. She knew nothing of what had happened to him, where he was, or whether privations and lack of food or sleep, together with Martin Roget's threats, had by now weakened his morale and turned his pride into humiliating submission. A distant tower clock struck the evening hours, one after the other. Yvonne, for the past 3 days, had only been vaguely conscious of time. Martin Roget had spoken of a few hours' respite only, of the proconsul's desire to be soon rid of her. Well, this meant no doubt that the morrow would see the end of it all, the end of her life which such a brief while ago seemed so full of delight, of love, and of happiness. The end of her life! She had barely begun to live, and her dear milord had whispered to her such sweet promises of endless vistas of bliss. Yvonne shivered beneath her thin gown. The northwesterly blast came in cool gusts through the unglazed window, and a vague instinct of self-preservation caused Yvonne to seek shelter in the one corner of the room where the icy draught did not penetrate quite so freely. 8, 9, and 10 struck from the tower clock far away. She heard these sounds as if in a dream. Tired, cold, and hungry, her vitality at that moment was at its lowest ebb, and, with her back resting against the wall, she fell presently into a torpor-like sleep. Suddenly something roused her, and in an instant she sat up, wide awake and wide-eyed, every one of her senses conscious and on the alert. Something had roused her. At first she could not say what it was, or remember. Then presently individual sounds detached themselves from the buzzing in her ears. Hitherto the house had always been so still, except on the isolated occasions when Martin Roget had come to visit her, and his heavy tread had caused every loose board in the tumble-down house to creak. It was only Louise Adet's shuffling footsteps which had roused the dormant echoes, for she crept downstairs either to her own room or to throw a piece of stale bread to her prisoner. But now it was neither Martin Roget's heavy footfall nor the shuffling gait of Louise Adet which had roused Yvonne from her trance-like sleep. It was a gentle, soft, creeping step which was slowly, cautiously mounting the stairs. Yvonne, crouching against the wall, could count every tread. Now and then a board creaked. Now and then the footsteps halted. Yvonne, wide-eyed, her heart stirred by nameless terror, was watching the door. The piece of tallow candle flickered in the draught. Its feeble light just touched the remote corner of the room, and Yvonne heard those soft, creeping footsteps as they reached the landing and came to a halt outside the door. Every drop of her blood seemed to be frozen by terror. Her knees shook. Her heart almost stopped its beating. Under the door, something small and white had just been introduced. A scrap of paper, and there it remained, white against the darkness of the unwashed boards, a mysterious message left there by an unknown hand, whilst the unknown footsteps softly crept down the stairs again. For a while longer Yvonne remained as she was, cowering against the wall, like a timid animal, fearful lest that innocent-looking object hide some unthought-of danger. Then at last she gathered courage. Trembling with excitement, she raised herself to her knees, and then on hands and knees, for she was very weak and faint, she crawled up to that mysterious piece of paper and picked it up. Her trembling hand closed over it. With wide, staring, terror-filled eyes, she looked all around the narrow room, ere she dared cast one more glance on that mysterious scrap of paper. Then she struggled to her feet and tottered up to the table. She sat down, and with fingers numbed with cold she smoothed out the paper and held it close to the light, trying to read what was written on it. Her sight was blurred. She had to pull herself resolutely together, for suddenly she felt ashamed of her weakness, and her overwhelming terror yielded to feverish excitement. The scrap of paper contained a message addressed to her in that name of which she was so proud, the name which she thought she would never be allowed to bear again, Lady Anthony Dewhurst. She reiterated the words several times, her lips clinging lovingly to them, and just below them there was a small device, drawn in red ink, a tiny flower with 5 petals. Yvonne frowned and murmured, vaguely puzzled, no longer frightened now, "A flower drawn in red. What can it mean?" And as a vague memory struggled for expression in her troubled mind, she added half aloud, "Oh, if it should be—" But now, suddenly all her fears fell away from her. Hope was once more knocking at the gates of her heart. Vague memories had taken definite shape. The mysterious letter, the message of hope, the red flower, all were gaining significance. She stooped low to read the letter by the feeble light of the flickering candle. She read it through with her eyes first, then with her lips in a soft murmur, while her mind gradually took in all that it meant for her. "Keep up your courage. Your friends are inside the city and on the watch. Try the door of your prison every evening at 1 hour before midnight. Once you will find it yield. Slip out and creep noiselessly down the stairs. At the bottom a friendly hand will be stretched out for you. Take it with confidence. It will lead you to safety and to freedom. Courage and secrecy." When she had finished reading, her eyes were swimming with tears. There was no longer any doubt in her mind about the message now, for her dear milor had so often spoken to her about the brave Scarlet Pimpernel who had risked his precious life many a time ere this, in order to render service to the innocent and the oppressed. And now, of a surety, this message came from him, from her dear milor and from his gallant chief. There was a small device, the little flower which had so often brought hope to despairing hearts. And it was more than hope that it brought to Yvonne. It brought certitude and happiness, and a sweet tender remorse that she should ever have doubted. She ought to have known all along that everything would be for the best. She had no right ever to have given away to despair. In her heart she prayed for forgiveness from her dear absent milord. How could she ever doubt him? Was it likely that he would abandon her? He and that brave friend of his whose powers were indeed magical. Why, she ought to have done her best to keep up her physical as well as her mental faculties. Who knows but perhaps physical strength might be of inestimable value to herself and to her gallant rescuers presently. She took up the stale brown bread and ate it resolutely. She drank some water and then stamped around the room to get some warmth into her limbs. A distant clock had struck 10 a while ago, and if possible she ought to get an hour's rest before the time came for her to be strong and to act. She shook up her meagre straw pelisse and lay down, determined if possible to get a little sleep, for indeed she felt that that was just what her dear milord would have wished her to do. Thus time went by. Waking or dreaming, Yvonne could never afterwards have said in what state she waited during that one long hour which separated her from the great blissful moment. The bit of candle burnt low and presently died out. After that Yvonne remained quite still upon the straw, in total darkness. No light came through the tiny window. Only the cold northwesterly wind blew in gusts. But of a surety, the prisoner who was within sight of freedom felt neither cold nor fatigue now. The tower clock in the distance struck the quarters with dreary monotony. The last stroke of 11 ceased to vibrate through the stillness of the winter's night. Yvonne roused herself from the torpor-like state into which she had fallen. She tried to struggle to her feet, but intensity of excitement had caused a strange numbness to invade her limbs. She could hardly move. A second ago it had seemed to her that she heard a gentle scraping noise at the door, a drawing of bolts, the grating of a key in the lock, and then again soft, shuffling footsteps that came and went, and that were not those of Louise Adet. At last Yvonne contrived to stand on her feet, but she had to close her eyes and to remain quite still a while after that, for her ears were buzzing and her head swimming. She thought she must fall if she moved and mayhap lose consciousness. But the state of weakness only lasted a few seconds. The next she had groped her way to the door, and her hand found the iron latch. It yielded. Then she waited, calling up all her strength, for the hour had come wherein she must not only think and act for herself, but think of every possibility which might occur, and act as she might imagine her dear lord would require it of her. She pressed the clumsy latch further. It yielded again, and anon she was able to push open the door. Excited yet confident, she tiptoed out of the room. The darkness, like unto pitch, was terribly disconcerting. With the exception of her narrow prison, Yvonne had only once seen the interior of the house, and that was when, half fainting, she had been dragged across its threshold and up the stairs. She had therefore only a very vague idea as to where the stairs lay, and how she was to get about without stumbling. Slowly and cautiously she crept a few paces forward. Then she turned and carefully closed the door behind her. There was not a sound inside the house. Everything was silent around her. Neither footfall nor whisperings reached her straining ears. She felt about her with her hands. She crouched down on her knees. Anon she discovered the head of the stairs. Then suddenly she drew back, like a frightened hare conscious of danger. All the blood rushed back to her heart, making it beat so violently that she once more felt sick and faint. A sound, gentle as a breath, had broken that absolute and dead silence which up to now had given her confidence. She felt suddenly that she was no longer alone in the darkness, that somewhere close by there was someone, friend or foe, who was lying in watch for her, that somewhere in the darkness something moved and breathed. The crackling of the paper inside her kerchief served to remind her that her dear milord was on the watch, and that the blessed message had spoken of a friendly hand which would be stretched out to her, and which she was enjoined to take with confidence. Reassured, she crept on again, and anon a softly murmured "Hush! Shh! Shh!" reached her ear. It seemed to come from down below, not very far, and Yvonne, having once more located the head of the stairs with her hands, began slowly to creep down, softly as a mouse, step by step, but every time that a board creaked, she paused, terrified, listening for Louise Adet's heavy footstep, for a sound that would mean the near approach of danger. "Hush, shh, shh," came again, as a gentle murmur from below, and the something that moved and breathed in the darkness seemed to draw nearer to Yvonne. A few more seconds of soul-racking suspense, a few more steps down the creaking stairs, and she felt a strong hand laid upon her wrist, and heard a muffled voice whisper in English, "All is well. Trust me. Follow me." She did not recognize the voice, even though there was something vaguely familiar in its intonation. Yvonne did not pause to conjecture. She had been made happy by the very sound of the language which stood to her for every word of love she had ever heard. It restored her courage and her confidence in their fullest measure. Obeying the whispered command, Yvonne was content now to follow her mysterious guide who had hold of her hand. The steps were steep and winding. At a turn she perceived a feeble light at their foot down below. Up against this feeble light the form of her guide was silhouetted in a dark, broad mass. Yvonne could see nothing of him beyond the square outline of his shoulders and that of his sugar-loaf hat. Her mind was now thrilled with excitement, and her fingers closed almost convulsively around his hand. He led her across Louise Adet's back kitchen. It was from here that the feeble light came, from a small oil lamp which stood on the centre table. It helped to guide Yvonne and her mysterious friend to the bottom of the stairs, then across the kitchen to the front door, where again complete darkness reigned. But soon Yvonne, who was following blindly, whithersoever she was led, heard the click of a latch and the grating of a door upon its hinges. A cold current of air caught her straight in the face. She could see nothing, for it seemed to be as dark out of doors as in, but she had the sensation of that open door, of a threshold to cross, of freedom and happiness beckoning to her straight out of the gloom. Within the next second or two she would be out of this terrible place. Its squalid and dank walls would be behind her. Within the next second or two she would be out of this terrible place. Its squalid and dank walls would be behind her. On ahead, in that thrice welcome obscurity, her dear milor and his powerful friend were beckoning to her to come boldly on. Their protecting arms were already stretched out for her. It seemed to her excited fancy as if the cold night wind brought to her ears the echoing of their endearing words. She filled her lungs with the keen winter air. Hope, happiness, excitement thrilled her every nerve. "A short walk, my lady," whispered the guide, still speaking in English. "You are not cold?" "No, no, I am not cold," she whispered in reply. "I am conscious of nothing save that I am free." "And you are not afraid?" Indeed, I am not afraid," she murmured fervently. "May God reward you, sir, for what you do." Again there had been that certain something, vaguely familiar in the way the man spoke, which for the moment piqued Yvonne's curiosity. She did not, of a truth, know English well enough to detect the very obvious foreign intonation. She only felt that sometime in the dim and happy past she had heard this man speak. But even this vague sense of puzzlement she dismissed very quickly from her mind. Was she not taking everything on trust? Indeed, hope and confidence had a very firm hold on her at last. End of Book 2, Chapter 5. Recording by Lilaread, Chicago, Illinois, United States of America. www.clilaread.wordpress.com. Book 2, Chapter 6, of Lord Tony's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lilaread. Lord Tony's Wife by Amuska ORCZY. Book 2, Chapter 6. The guide had stepped out of the house into the street, Yvonne following closely on his heels. The night was very dark, and the narrow little Carrefour de la Poissonnerie very sparsely lighted. Somewhere overhead, on the right, something groaned and creaked persistently in the wind. A little further on, a street lantern was swinging aloft, throwing a small circle of dim, yellowish light on the unpaved street below. By its fitful glimmer, Yvonne could vaguely perceive the tall figure of her guide as he stepped out with noiseless yet firm tread, his shoulder brushing against the side of the nearest house as he kept closely within the shadow of its high wall. The sight of his broad back thrilled her. She had fallen to imagining whether this was not perchance that gallant and all-powerful Scarlet Pimpernel himself, the mysterious friend of whom her dear milor so often spoke with an admiration that was akin to worship. He, too, was probably tall and broad, for English gentlemen were usually built that way, and Yvonne's over-excited mind went galloping on the wings of fancy, and in her heart she felt that she was glad that she had suffered so much, and then lived through such a glorious moment as this. Now from the narrow, unpaved yard in the front of the house the guide turned sharply to the right. Yvonne could only distinguish outlines. The streets of Nantes were familiar to her, and she knew pretty well where she was. The lantern inside the clock tower of Le Buffet guided her, and it was now on her right. The house wherein she had been kept prisoner these past 3 days was built against the walls of the great prison-house. She knew that she was in the Carrefour de la Poissonnerie. She felt neither fatigue nor cold, for she was wildly excited. The keen northwesterly wind searched all the weak places in her worn clothing, and her thin shoes were wet through. But her courage up to this point had never once forsaken her. Hope and the feeling of freedom gave her marvellous strength, and when her guide paused a moment ere he turned to the angle of the high wall and whispered hurriedly, "You have courage, my lady?" she was able to answer serenely, "In plenty, sir." She tried to peer into the darkness in order to realize whither she was being led. The guide had come to a halt in front of the house, which was next to that of Louise Adet. It was projected several feet in front of the latter. The thing that had creaked so weirdly in the wind turned out to be a painted sign, which swung out from an iron bracket fixed into the wall. Yvonne could not read the writing on the sign, but she noticed that just above it there was a small window dimly lighted from within. What sort of a house it was Yvonne could not, of course, see. The frontage was dark save for narrow streaks of light, which peeped through the interstices of the door, and through the chinks of ill-fastened shutters on either side. Not a sound came from within, but now the guide had come to a halt, it seemed to Yvonne, whose nerves and senses had become preternaturally acute, that the whole air around her was filled with muffled sounds, and when she stood still and strained her ears to listen, she was conscious, right through the inky darkness, of vague forms, shapeless and silent, that glided past her in the gloom. "Your friends will meet you here," the guide whispered as he pointed to the door of the house in front of him. "The door is on the latch. Push it open and walk in boldly, then gather up all of your courage, for you will find yourself in the company of poor people, whose manners are somewhat rougher than those to which you have been accustomed. But though the people are uncouth, you will find them kind. Above all, you will find that they will pay no heed to you. So I entreat you, do not be afraid. Your friends would have arranged for a more refined place wherein to come and find you, but as you well may imagine, they had no choice." "I quite understand, sir," said Yvonne quietly, "and I am not afraid." "Ah, that's brave," he rejoined. "Then do as I tell you. I give you my word that inside the house you will be perfectly safe until such time as your friends are able to get to you. You may have to wait an hour or even 2. You must have patience. Find a quiet place in one of the corners of the room and sit there quietly. Take no notice of what goes on around you. You will be quite safe, and the arrival of your friends is only a question of time." "My friend, sir?" she said earnestly, and her voice shook slightly as she spoke. "Are you not one of the most devoted friends I can ever hope to have? I cannot find the words now wherewith to thank you, but—" "I pray you do not thank me," he broke in gruffly, "and do not waste time in parleying. The open street is none too safe a place for you just now. The house is." His hand was on the latch, and he was about to push open the door when Yvonne stopped him with a word. "My father," she whispered with passionate entreaty, "will you help him too?" "Monsieur le Duc de Kernogan is as safe as you are, my lady, he replied. He will join you anon. I pray that you have no fears for him. Your friends are caring for him in the same way as they care for you. Then I shall see him soon? Very soon. And in the meanwhile, he added, I pray to you to sit quite still and to wait events, despite anything you may see or hear. Your father's safety and your own, not to speak of that of your friends, hangs on your quiescence, your silence, your obedience. I will remember, sir, rejoined Yvonne quietly. I in my turn entreat you to have no fears for me. Even while she said this, the man pushed the door open. Yvonne had meant to be brave. Above all, she had meant to be obedient. But even so, she could not help recoiling at the sight of the place where she had just been told she must wait patiently and silently for an hour or even 2. The room into which her guide now gently urged her forward was large and low, only dimly lighted by an oil lamp which hung from the ceiling and emitted a thin stream of black smoke and evil smell. Such air as there was foul and reeked of the fumes of alcohol and charcoal, of the smoking lamp and of rancid grease. The walls had no doubt been whitewashed once. Now they were of a dull greyish tint, with here and there hideous stains of red, or the marks of a set of greasy fingers. The plaster was hanging in strips and lumps from the ceiling. It had fallen away in patches from the walls, where it displayed the skeleton laths beneath. There were 2 doors in the wall immediately facing the front entrance, and on each side of the latter there was a small window, both insecurely shuttered. To Yvonne the whole place appeared unspeakably squalid and noisome. Even as she entered, her ears caught the sound of hideous muttered blasphemy, followed by quickly suppressed hoarse and mirthless laughter, and the piteous cry of an infant at the breast. There were perhaps 16 to 20 people in the room, amongst them a goodly number of women, some of whom had tiny, miserable atoms of humanity clinging to their ragged skirts. A group of men in tattered shirts, bare shins, and sabots stood in the centre of the room, and had apparently been in conclave when the entrance of Yvonne and her guide caused them to turn quickly to the door and to scan the newcomers with a furtive, suspicious look, which would have been pathetic had it not been so full of evil intent. The muttered blasphemy had come from this group. 1 or 2 of the men spat upon the ground in the direction of the door, where Yvonne instinctively had remained rooted to the spot. As for the women, they only betrayed their sex by the ragged clothes which they wore. There was not a face there which had on it a single line of softness or of gentleness. They might have been old women or young. The hair was of a uniform nondescript colour, lank and unkempt, hanging in thin strands over their brows. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks either flaccid or haggard. There was no individuality amongst them, just one uniform sisterhood of wretchedness, which had already gone hand in hand with crime. Across one angle of the room there was a high wooden counter like a bar, on which stood a number of jugs and bottles, some chunks of bread, and pieces of cheese, and a collection of pewter mugs. An old man and a fat, coarse-featured, middle-aged woman stood behind it, and dispensed various noxious-looking liquors. Above their heads, upon the grimy tumble-down wall, the Republican device, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, was scrawled in charcoal in huge characters, and below it was scribbled the hideous doggerel which an impious mind had fashioned the last autumn on the subject of the martyred queen. Yvonne had closed her eyes for a moment as she entered. Now she turned appealingly toward her guide. "Must it be in here?" she asked. "I'm afraid it must," he replied with a sigh. "You told me that you would be brave." She pulled herself together resolutely. "I will be brave," she said quietly. "Ah, that's better," he rejoined. "I give you my word that you will be absolutely safe in here until such a time as your friends can get to you. I entreat you to gather up your courage. I assure you that these wretched people are not unkind. Misery, not unlike that which you yourself have endured, has made them what they are. No doubt we should have arranged for a better place for you wherein to await your friends if we had the choice, but you will understand that your safety and our own had to be our paramount consideration, and we had no choice." "I quite understand, sir," said Yvonne valiantly. and am already ashamed of my fears." And without another word of protest, she stepped boldly into the room. For a moment or two the guide remained standing upon the threshold, watching Yvonne's progress. She had already perceived an empty bench in the farthest angle of the room, up against the door opposite, where she hoped or believed that she could remain unmolested while she waited patiently and in silence as she had been ordered to do. She skirted the groups of men in the centre of the room as she went, but even though she felt more than she heard, that muttered insult accompanied the furtive and glowering looks wherewith she was regarded. More than one wretch spat upon her skirts on the way. But now she was in no sense frightened, only wildly excited. Even her feeling of horror she contrived to conquer. The knowledge that her own attitude, and above all her obedience, could help her gallant rescuers in their work, gave her enduring strength. She felt quite confident that within an hour or two she would be in the arms of a dear milord who had risked his life in order to come to her. It was indeed well worth while to have suffered as she had done, and to endure all that she might yet have to endure, for the sake of the happiness which was in store for her. She turned to give a last look to her guide, a look which was intended to reassure him completely as to her courage and her obedience. But already he had gone, and had closed the door behind him, and quite against her will the sudden sense of loneliness and helplessness clutched at her heart with a grip that made it ache. She wished that she had succeeded in catching sight of the face of so valiant a friend. The fact that she was safely out of Louise Adet's vengeful clutches was due to the man who had just disappeared behind that door. It would be thanks to him presently if she saw her father again. Yvonne felt more convinced than ever that he was the Scarlet Pimpernel, milord's friend, who kept his valiant personality a mystery even to those who owed their lives to him. She had seen the outline of his broad figure, she had felt the touch of his hand. Would she recognize these again when she met him in England in the happy days that were to come? In any case, she thought she would recognize the voice and the manner of speaking, so unlike that of any English gentleman she had known. The man who had so mysteriously led Yvonne de Kernogan from the house of Louise Adet to the Rat Mort turned away from the door of the tavern as soon as it had closed on the young girl, and started to go back the way he came. At the angle formed by the high wall of the tavern, he paused. A moving form had detached itself from the surrounding gloom and hailed him with a cautious whisper. "Hist! Citizen Roger, is that you?" "Yes." "Everything is just as we anticipated?" "Everything." "Are the wench safely inside?" "Quite safely." The other gave a low cackle which might have been intended for a laugh. "The simplest means," he said, "are always the best." "She never suspected me. It was all perfectly simple. You are a magician, Citizen Chauvelin," added Roger grudgingly. "I would never have thought of such a clever scheme." "You see," rejoined Chauvelin dryly, "I graduated in the school of a master of all ruses, a master of daring, and a past master in the art of mimicry. And hope is our great ally, the hope that never forsakes a prisoner, that of getting free. Your fair Yvonne had boundless faith in the power of her English friends, therefore she fell into our trap like a bird. And like a bird she shall struggle in vain after this," said Roger slowly. "Oh, that I could hasten the flight of time! The next few minutes will hang on me like hours. And I wish, too, it were not so bitterly cold," he added with a curse. "This northwesterly wind has gotten into my bones." "Onto your nerves, I imagine, citizen," retorted Chauvelin with a laugh. "For my part, I feel as warm and comfortable as on a lovely day in June." "Hark! Who goes there?" broke in the other man abruptly, as a solitary moving form detached itself from the surrounding inky blackness, and the sound of measured footsteps broke the citizen of the night. "Quite in order, citizen," was the prompt reply. The shadowy form came a step or two further forward. "Is it you, Citizen Fleury?" queried Chauvelin. "Himself, citizen," replied the other. The men had spoken in a whisper. Fleury now placed his hand on Chauvelin's arm. "We had better not stand so close to the tavern," he said. "The night hawks are already about, and we don't want to scare them." He led the others up the yard, and then into a very narrow passage which lay between Louise Adet's house and the Rat Mort, and was bordered by the high wall of the houses on either side. "This is Blind Alley," he whispered. "We have a wall of Le Bouffay in front of us, The wall of the Rat Moor is on one side, and the house of the Citizeness Adet on the other. We can talk here undisturbed." Overhead there was a tiny window dimly lighted from within. Chauvelin pointed up to it. "What is that?" he asked. "An aperture too small for any human being to pass through," replied Fleury dryly. "It gives on a small landing at the foot of the stairs. I told Fichet to try and manoeuvre so that the wench and her father were pushed in there out of the way while the worst of the fracas is going on. That was your suggestion, Citizen Chauvelin." "It was. I was afraid that the two aristos might get spirited away while your men are tackling the crowd in the tap-room. I want them put away in a safe place." "The staircase is safe enough," rejoined Fleury. "It has no egress save that on the tap-room, and only leads to the upper story in the attic. The house has no back entrance. It is built against the wall of Le Buffet. And what about your Marats, Citizen Commandant?" "Oh, I have them all along the street, entirely under cover, but closely on the watch. Half a company and all keen after the game. The 1,000 francs you promised them has stimulated their zeal most marvellously, and as soon as Paul Fichet in there has whipped up the tempers of the frequenters of the Rat Moor, we shall be ready to rush the place, and I assure you, Citizen Chauvelin, that only a disembodied ghost, if there be one in the place, will succeed in evading arrest." "Is Paul Fichet already at his post, then?" "And at work, or I'm much mistaken," replied Fleury, as he suddenly gripped Chauvelin by the arm. For just at this moment the silence of the winter's night was broken by loud cries which came from the interior of the Rat Moor. Voices were raised to hoarse and raucous cries. Men and women all appeared to be shrieking together, and presently there was a loud crash as of overturned furniture and broken glass. "A few minutes longer, Citizen Fleury," said Chauvelin, as the commandant of the Marats turned on his heel and started to go back to the Carrefour de la Poissonnerie. "Oh, yes," whispered the latter. "We'll wait a while longer to give the Englishmen time to arrive on the scene. The coast is clear for them. My Marats are hidden from sight behind the doorways and shop fronts of the houses opposite. In about 3 minutes from now I'll send them forward." "And good luck to your hunting, citizen," whispered Chauvelin in response. Fleury very quickly disappeared in the darkness, and the two other men followed in his wake. They hugged the wall of the Rat Moor as they went along, and its shadow enveloped them completely. Their shoes made no sound on the unpaved ground. Chauvelin's nostrils quivered as he drew the keen cold air into his lungs and faced the northwesterly blast, which at this moment also lashed across the face of his enemy. His keen eyes tried to pierce the gloom, his ears were strained to hear that merry peal of laughter which in the unforgettable past had been one to proclaim the present of the reckless adventurer. He knew, he felt, as certainly as he felt the air which he breathed, that the man whom he hated beyond everything on earth was somewhere close by, wrapped in the murkiness of the night, thinking, planning, intriguing, pitting his sharp wits, his indomitable pluck, his imprudent dare-devilry against the sure and patient trap which had been set for him. Half a company of Marats in front, the walls of Le Buffet in the rear. Chauvelin rubbed his thin hands together. "You're not a disembodied ghost, my fine Scarlet Pimpernel," he murmured, "and this time I really think—" End of Rat Moor. Book 2, Chapter 6 of Lord Tony's Wife. Read by Lilaread. www.seelilaread.wordpress.com.
Chapter 7 of Lord Tony's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines. Lord Tony's Wife by Baroness ORCZY. Chapter 7. The Fracas in the Tavern. Part 1. Yvonne had settled herself in a corner of the tap room on a bench, and had tried to lose consciousness of her surroundings. It was not easy. Glances charged with rancour were levelled at her dainty appearance, dainty and refined despite the look of starvation and of weariness on her face and the miserable state of her clothing, and not a few muttered insults waited on those glances. As soon as she was seated, Yvonne noticed that the old man and the coarse fat woman behind the bar started an animated conversation together, of which she was very obviously the object, for the two heads, the lean and the round, were jerked more than once in her direction. Presently the man, it was George Lemoine, the proprietor of the Rat Mort, came up to where she was sitting. His lank figure was bent so that his lean back formed the best part of an arc, and an expression of mock deference further distorted his ugly face. He came up quite close to Yvonne, and she found it passing difficult not to draw away from him, for the leer on his face was appalling. His eyes, which were set very near to his hooked nose, had a horrible squint. His lips were thick and moist, and his breath reeked of alcohol. "What will the noble lady deign to drink?" he now asked in an oily, suave voice. And Yvonne, remembering the guide's admonition, contrived to smile unconcernedly into the hideous face. "I would very much like some wine," she said cheerfully, "but I am afraid that I have no money wherewith to pay you for it." The creature with a gesture of abject humility rubbed his greasy hands together. "And may I respectfully ask," he queried blandly, "what are the intentions of the noble lady in coming to this humble abode, if she hath no desire to partake of refreshments?" "I am expecting friends," replied Yvonne bravely. "They will be here very soon, and will gladly repay you lavishly for all the kindness which you may be inclined to show me the while." She was very brave indeed, and looked this awful misshapen specimen of a man quite boldly in the face. She even contrived to smile, though she was well aware that a number of men and women, perhaps a dozen altogether, had congregated in front of her in a compact group around the landlord, that they were nudging one another and pointing derisively, malevolently, at her. It was impossible, despite all attempts at valor, to mistake the hostile attitude of these people. Some of the most obscene words, coined during these last horrible days of the Revolution, were freely hurled at her, and one woman suddenly cried out in a shrill treble: "Throw her out, citizen Lemoine. We don't want spies in here." "Indeed, indeed," said Yvonne as quietly as she could, "I am no spy. I am poor and wretched like yourselves, and desperately lonely, save for the kind friends who will meet me here anon." "Aristos like yourself," growled one of the men. "This is no place for you or for them." "No, no, this is no place for aristos," cried one of the women, in a voice which many excesses and many vices had rendered hoarse and rough. "Spy or not, we don't want you in here. Do we?" she added, as with arms akimbo she turned to face those of her own sex who behind the men had come up in order to see what was going on. "Throw her out, Lemoine," reiterated a man who appeared to be an oracle amongst the others. "Please, please let me stop here," pleaded Yvonne. "If you turn me out I shall not know what to do. I shall not know where to meet my friends." "Pretty story about those friends," broke in Lemoine roughly. "How do I know if you're lying or not?" From the opposite angle of the room, the woman behind the bar had been watching the little scene with eyes that glittered with cupidity. Now she emerged from behind her stronghold of bottles and mugs and slowly waddled across the room. She pushed her way unceremoniously past her customers, elbowing men, women and children vigorously aside with a deft play of her large muscular arms. Having reached the forefront of the little group, she came to a standstill immediately in front of Yvonne, and crossing her mighty arms over her ponderous chest, she eyed the aristo with unconcealed malignity. "We do know that the slut is lying. That is where you make the mistake, Lemoine. A slut, that's what she is. And the friend whom she's going to meet, well," she added, turning with an ugly leer toward the other women, We all know what sort of friend that one is likely to be, eh, mesdames? Bringing evil fame on this house, that's what the wench is after, so as to bring the police about our ears. I wouldn't trust her, not another minute. Out with you, and at once, do you hear? This instant. Le Moyne has parleyed quite long enough with you already." Despite all her resolutions, Yvonne was terribly frightened. While the hideous old hag talked and screamed and waved her coarse, red arms about, the unfortunate young girl, with a great effort of will, kept repeating to herself: "I am not frightened. I must not be frightened. He assured me that these people would do me no harm." But now, when the woman had ceased speaking, there was a general murmur of "Throw her out! Spy or aristo, we don't want her here," whilst some of the men added significantly: "I am sure that she is one of Carrier's spies and in league with his Marats. We shall have those devils in here in a moment if we don't look out. Throw her out, before she can signal to the Marats." Ugly faces charged with hatred and virulence were thrust threateningly forward. One or two of the women were obviously looking forward to joining in the scramble, when this stuck-up wench would presently be hurled out into the street. "Now then, my girl, out you get," concluded the woman Le Moyne, as with an expressive gesture she proceeded to roll her sleeves higher up on her arm. She was about to lay her dirty hands on Yvonne, and the poor girl was nearly sick with horror, when one of the men, a huge, coarse giant, whose muscular torso, covered with grease and grime, showed almost naked through ragged shirt which hung from his shoulders in strips, seized the woman Le Moyne by the arm and dragged her back a step or two away from Yvonne. "Don't be a fool, petite Marie," he said, accompanying this admonition with a blasphemous oath. "Slut or no, the wench may as well pay you something for the privilege of staying here. Look at that cloak she's wearing, the shoe leather on her feet. Aren't they worth a bottle of your sour wine?" "What's that to you, Paul Friche?" retorted the woman roughly, as with a vigorous gesture she freed her arm from the man's grasp. "Is this my house or yours?" "Yours, of course," replied the man with a coarse laugh and still a coarser jest, "but this won't be the first time that I have saved you from impulsive folly. Yesterday you were for harbouring a couple of rogues who were Marats in disguise. If I hadn't given you warning, you would now have swallowed more water from the Loire than you would care to hold. But for me, 2 days ago you would have received the goods pinched by Ferté out of Balazs's shop, and been thrown to the fishes in consequence, for the entertainment of the proconsul and his friends. You must admit that I've been a good friend to you before now." "And if you have, Paul Friche," retorted the hag obstinately, "I paid you well for your friendship, both yesterday and the day before, didn't I?" "You did," assented Friche imperturbably. "That's why I want to serve you again to night." "Don't listen to him, petite Marie," interposed one of two out of the crowd. "He is a white livered skunk to talk to you like that." Very well," quoth Paul Friche, and he spat vigorously on the ground in token that henceforth he divested himself from any responsibility in this matter. "Don't listen to me. Lose a benefit of 20, perhaps 40 francs for the sake of a bit of fun. Very well," he continued, as he turned and slouched out of the group to the further end of the room, where he sat down on a barrel. He drew the stump of a clay pipe out of the pocket of his breeches, stuffed it into his mouth, stretched his long legs out before him, and sucked away at his pipe with complacent detachment. "I didn't know," he added with biting sarcasm, by the way of a parting shot, "that you and Le Moyne had come into a fortune recently, and that 40 or 50 francs are nothing to you now." "40 or 50! Come," protested Le Moyne feebly. II. Yvonne's fate was hanging in the balance. The attitude of the small crowd was no less threatening than before, but immediate action was withheld, while the Le Moynes obviously debated in their minds what was best to be done. The instinct to have at an aristo with all the accumulated hatred of many generations was warring with the innate rapacity of the Breton peasant. 40 or 50, reiterated Paul Friche emphatically. Can't you see that the wench is an aristo escaped out of La Buffet, or the Entrepot?" he added contemptuously. "I know that she is an aristo," said the woman, "that's why I want to throw her out." "And get nothing for your pains?" retorted Friche roughly. "If you wait for her friends, we may all of us get as much as 20 francs each to hold our tongues." 20 francs each! The murmur was repeated with many a sigh of savage gluttony by every one in the room, and repeated again and again, especially by the women. "You are a fool, Paul Friche," commented Lemoine. "A fool, am I?" retorted the giant. "Then let me tell you that 'tis you who are a fool and worse. I happen to know," he added, as he once more rose and rejoined the group in the centre of the room, "I happen to know that you and every one here is heading straight for a trap arranged by the Committee of Public Safety, whose chief emissary came into Nantes a while ago and is named Chauvelin. It is a trap which will land all you in the criminal dock first and on the way to Cayenne or the guillotine afterwards. This place is surrounded with Marats, and orders have been issued to them to make a descent on this place as soon as Papa Lemoine's customers are assembled. There are 2 members of the accursed company amongst us at the present moment." He was standing right in the middle of the room, immediately beneath the hanging lamp. At his words, spoken with such firm confidence, as one who knows and is therefore empowered to speak, a sudden change came over the spirit of the whole assembly. Everything was forgotten in the face of this new danger. 2 Marats, the sleuth hounds of the proconsul, here present as spies and as informants! Every face became more haggard, every cheek more livid. There was a quick and furtive scurrying toward the front door. "2 Marats here!" shouted one man who was bolder than the rest. "Where are they?" Paul Friche, who towered above his friends, stood at this moment quite close to a small man, dressed like the others in ragged breeches and shirt, and wearing the broad brimmed hat usually affected by the Breton peasantry. "2 Marats! 2 spies!" screeched a woman. "Where are they?" "Here is one," replied Paul Friche with a loud laugh, and with his large grimy hand he lifted the hat from his neighbour's head and threw it on the ground. "And there," he added, as with long bony finger he pointed to the front door, where another man, a square built youngster with tow coloured hair somewhat resembling a shaggy dog, was endeavouring to effect a surreptitious exit, "there is the other, and he is on the point of slipping quietly away in order to report to his captain what he has seen and heard at the Rat Mort. One moment, citizen," he added, and with a couple of giant strides he too had reached the door. His large rough hand had come down heavily on the shoulder of the youth with the tow coloured hair, and had forced him to veer round and to face the angry gesticulating crowd. "2 Marats! 2 spies!" shouted the men. "Now we'll soon settle their little business for them." "Marat yourself!" cried this small man who had first been denounced by Friche. "I am no Marat, as a good many of you here know. Maman Lemoine," he added pleading, "you know me. Am I a Marat?" But the Lemoines, man and wife, at the first suggestion of police, had turned a deaf ear to all their customers. Their own safety being in jeopardy, they cared little what happened to anybody else. They had retired behind their counter and were in close consultation together, no doubt, as to the best means of escape if indeed the man Paul Friche spoke the truth. "I know nothing about him," the woman was saying, "but he certainly was right last night about those 2 men who came ferreting in here, and last week too." "Am I a Marat, Maman Lemoine?" shouted the small man as he hammered his fists upon the counter. "For 10 years and more I have been a customer in this place, and...." "Am I a Marat?" shouted the youth with the tow coloured hair, addressing the assembly indiscriminately. "Some of you here know me well enough. Jean Paul, you know. Ledouble, you too." Of course, I know you well enough, Jacques Leroux," came with a loud laugh from one of the crowd. "Who said you were a Marat?" "Am I a Marat, Maman Lemoine?" reiterated the small man at the counter. "Oh, leave me alone with your quarrels," shouted the woman Lemoine in reply. "Settle them among yourselves." "Then if Jacques Leroux is not a Marat," now came in a bibulous voice from a distant corner of the room, "and this compère here is known to Maman Lemoine, where are the real Marats who according to this fellow Friche, whom we none of us know, are spying upon us?" "Yes, where are they?" suggested another. "Show 'em to us, Paul Friche, or whatever your accursed name happens to be." "Tell us where you come from yourself," screamed the woman with a shrill treble. "It seems to me quite possible that you're a Marat yourself." This suggestion was at once taken up. "Marat yourself," shouted the crowd, and the two men who a moment ago had been accused of being spies in disguise shouted louder than the rest: "Marat yourself." III. After that, pandemonium reigned. The words police and Marats had aroused the terror of all these night hawks, who were wont to think themselves immune inside their lair. And terror is at all times an evil counsellor. In the space of a few seconds confusion held undisputed sway. Every one screamed, waved arms, stamped feet, struck out with heavy bare fists at his nearest neighbour. Every one's hand was against every one else. "Spy! Marat! Informer!" were the three words that detached themselves most clearly from out the babel of vituperations freely hurled from end to end of the room. The children screamed, the women's shrill or hoarse treble mingled with the cries and imprecations of the men. Paul Friche had noted that the turn of the tide was against him long before the first naked fist had been brandished in his face. Agile as a monkey he had pushed his way through to the bar, and placing his two hands upon it, with a swift leap he had taken up a sitting position in the very middle of the table amongst the jugs and bottles, which he promptly seized and used as missiles and weapons, whilst with his dangling feet encased in heavy sabots he kicked out vigorously and unceasingly against the shins of his foremost assailants. He had the advantage of position and used it cleverly. In his right hand he held a pewter mug by the handle, and used it as a swivel against his aggressors with great effect. "The Loire for you, you blackmailer, liar, traitor!" shouted some of the women who, bolder than the men, thrust shaking fists at Paul Friche as closely as that pewter mug would allow. "Break his jaw before he can yell for the police," admonished one of the men from the rear, "before he can save his own skin." But those who shouted loudest had only their fists by way of weapon, and Paul Friche had mugs and bottles, and those sabots of his kicked out with uncomfortable agility. "Break my jaw, will you?" he shouted every time that a blow from the mug went home. "A spy, am I? Very well then, here's for you, Jacques Leroux. Go and nurse your cracked skull at home. You want a row," he added, hitting at a youth who was brandishing a heavy fist in his face. "Well, you shall have it, and as much of it as you like, as much of it as will bring the patrols of police comfortably about your ears." Bang! went the pewter mug crashing against a man's hard skull. Bang! went Paul Friche's naked fist against the chest of another. He was a hard hitter and swift. The Lemoines from behind their bar shouted louder than the rest, doing as much as their lungs would allow them in the way of admonishing, entreating, protesting, cursing everyone for a set of fools who were playing straight into the hands of the police. Now then, children, stop that bellowing, will you? There are no spies here. Paul Friche was only having his little joke. We all know one another, what? Camels!" added Lemoine more forcibly. "They'll bring the patrols about our ears for sure." Paul Friche was not by any means the only man who was being vigorously attacked. After the first 2 or 3 minutes of this kingdom of pandemonium, it was difficult to say who was quarrelling with whom. Old grudges were revived, old feuds taken up there, where they had previously been interrupted. Accusations of spying were followed by abuse for some past wrong of blacklegging or cheating a confrère. The temperature of the room became suffocating. All these violent passions seething within these four walls seemed to become tangible, and to mingle with the atmosphere already surcharged with the fumes of alcohol, of tobacco, and of perspiring humanity. There was many a black eye already, many a contusion. More than one knife, surreptitiously drawn, was already stained with red. IV. There was also a stampede for the door. One man gave the signal. Seeing that his mates were wasting precious time by venting their wrath against Paul Friche and then quarrelling among themselves, he hoped to effect an escape ere the police came to stop the noise. No one believed in the place being surrounded. Why should it be? The Marats were far too busy hunting up rebels and aristos to trouble much about the Rat Mort and its customers. But it was quite possible that a brawl would bring a patrol along, and then, where the police correctionnelle and the possibility of deportation or worse, retreat was undoubtedly safer while there was time. One man first, then one or two more on his heels, and those among the women who had children in their arms or clinging to their skirts, they turned stealthily to the door, almost ashamed of their cowardice, ashamed lest they were seen abandoning the field of combat. It was while confusion reigned unchecked that Yvonne, who was cowering, frankly terrified at last, in the corner of the room, became aware that the door close beside her, the door situated immediately opposite the front entrance, was surreptitiously opened. She turned quickly to look, for she was like a terror-stricken little animal now, one that scents and feels and fears dangers from every quarter round. The door was being pushed open very slowly by what was still to Yvonne an unseen hand. Somehow that opening door fascinated her. For the moment she forgot the noise and the confusion around her. Then suddenly, with a great effort of will, she checked the scream which had forced itself up to her throat. "Father!" was all that she contrived to say in a hoarse and passionate murmur. Fortunately, as he peered cautiously round the room, M. le duc caught sight of his daughter. She was staring at him, wide-eyed, her lips bloodless, her cheeks the colour of ashes. He looked, but the ghost now of that proud aristo who little more than a week ago was the centre of a group of courtiers around the person of the heir to the English throne. Starved, emaciated, livid, he was the shadow of his former self, and there was a haunted look in his purple rimmed eyes which spoke with pathetic eloquence of sleepless night and of a soul tortured with remorse. Just for the moment no one took any notice of him. Every one was shrieking, every one was quarrelling, and M. le duc, placing a finger to his lips, stole cautiously round to his daughter. The next instant they were clinging to one another, these two who had endured so much together, he the father who had wrought such an unspeakable wrong, and she the child who was so lonely, so forlorn and almost happy in finding some one who belonged to her, some one to whom she could cling. "Father, dear, what shall we do?" Yvonne murmured, for she felt the last shred of her fictitious courage oozing out of her, in face of this awful lawlessness which literally paralysed her thinking faculties. "Sh, dear," whispered M. le duc in reply, "we must get out of this loathsome place while this hideous row is going on. I heard it all from the filthy garret up above, where those devils have kept me these 3 days. The door was not locked. I crept downstairs. No one is paying heed to us. We can creep out. Come." But at the suggestion, Yvonne's spirits, which had been stunned by the events of the past few moments, revived with truly mercurial rapidity. "No, no, dear," she urged, "we must stay here. You don't know. I have had a message from my own dear milor, my husband. He sent a friend to take me out of the hideous prison where that awful Pierre Adet was keeping me, a friend who assured me that my dear milor was watching over me. He brought me to this place and begged me not to be frightened, but to wait patiently, and I must wait, dear, I must wait." She spoke rapidly in whispers and in short, jerky sentences. Monsieur le duc listened to her wide-eyed, a deep line of puzzlement between his brows. Sorrow, remorse, starvation, misery had in a measure numbed his mind. The thought of help, of hope, of friends could not penetrate into his brain. "A message," he murmured inanely, "a message? No, no, my girl, you must trust no one. Pierre Adet is full of evil tricks. He will trap you. He means to destroy us both. He has brought you here so that you should be murdered by these ferocious devils." "Impossible, father dear," she said, still striving to speak bravely. "We have both of us been all this while in the power of Pierre Adet. He could have had no object in bringing me here to night." But the father who had been an insentient fool in the schemes of that miserable intriguer, who had been the means of bringing his only child to this terrible and deadly pass, the man who had listened to the lying counsels and proposals of his own most bitter enemy, could only groan now in terror and in doubt. "Who can probe the depths of that abominable villain's plans?" he murmured vaguely. In the meanwhile the little group who had thought prudence the better part of valour had reached the door. The foremost man amongst them opened it and peered cautiously out into the darkness. He turned back to those behind him, put a finger to his lip and beckoned to them to follow him in silence. "Yvonne, let us go," whispered the duc, who had seized his daughter by the hand. "But father...." "Let us go," he reiterated pitiably. "I shall die if we stay here." "It won't be for long, father dear," she entreated. "If milor should come with his friend and find us gone, we should be endangering his life as well as our own." "I don't believe it," he rejoined with the obstinacy of weakness. "I don't believe in your message. How could milor or any one come to your rescue, my child? No one knows that you are here in this hell in Nantes." Yvonne clung to him with the strength of despair. She too was as terrified as any human creature could be and live. But terror had not altogether swept away her belief in that mysterious message, in that tall guide who had led her hither, in that scarlet device, the 5-petalled flower which stood for everything that was most gallant and most brave. She desired with all her might to remain here, despite everything, despite the awful brawl that was raging around her, and which sickened her, despite the horror of the whole thing, to remain here and to wait. She put her arms round her father, she dragged him back every time he tried to move, but a sort of unnatural strength seemed to have conquered his former debility. His attempts to get away became more and more determined and more febrile. "Come, Yvonne, we must go," he continued to murmur intermittently and with ever growing obstinacy. "No one will notice us. I heard the noise from my garret upstairs. I crept down. I knew no one would notice me. Come, we must go. Now is our time." "Father dear, whither could we go? Once in the street of Nantes, what would happen to us?" "We can find our way to the Loire," he retorted almost brutally. He shook himself free from her restraining arms and gripped her firmly by the hand. He tried to drag her toward the door, whilst she still struggled to keep him back. He had just caught sight of the group of men and women at the front door. Their leader was standing upon the threshold and was still peering out into the darkness. But the next moment they all came to a halt. What their leader had perceived through the darkness did not evidently quite satisfy him. He turned and held a whispered consultation with the others. M. le duc strove with all his might to join in with that group. He felt that in its wake would lie the road to freedom. He would have struck Yvonne for standing in the way of her own safety. "Father dear," she contrived finally to say to him, "if you go hence, you will go alone. Nothing will move me from here, because I know that milor will come." "Curse you for your obstinacy," retorted the duc. "You jeopardise my life and yours." Then suddenly from the angle of the room where wrangling and fighting were at their fiercest there came a loud call: "Look out, Pere Lemoine, your aristos are running away. You are losing your last chance of those 50 francs." It was Paul Friche who had shouted. His position on the table was giving him a commanding view over the heads of the threatening, shouting, perspiring crowd, and he had just caught sight of M. le duc dragging his daughter by force toward the door. "The authors of all this pother," he said in an oath, "and they will get away whilst we have the police about our ears." "Name of a dog," swore Lemoine from behind his bar, "that shall not be. Come along, maman. Let us bring those aristos along here. Quick now." It was all done in a second. Lemoine and his wife, with the weight and authority of the masters of the establishment, contrived to elbow their way through the crowd. The next moment Yvonne felt herself forcibly dragged away from her father. "This way, my girl, and no screaming," a bibulous voice said in her ear. "No screaming, or I'll smash some of those front teeth of yours. You said some rich friends were coming along for you presently. Well then, come and wait for them out of the crowd." Indeed Yvonne had no desire to struggle or to scream. Salvation, she thought, had come to her and to her father in this rough guise. In another moment mayhap he would have forced her to follow him, to leave milor in the lurch, to jeopardise for ever every chance of safety. "It is all for the best, father dear," she managed to cry over her shoulder, for she had just caught sight of him being seized round the shoulders by Lemoine and heard him protesting loudly. "I'll not go! I'll not go! Let me go!" he shouted hoarsely. "My daughter! Yvonne! Let me go! You devil!" But Lemoine had twice the vigour of the duc de Kernogan, nor did he care one jot about the other's protests. He hated all this row inside his house, but there had been rows in it before and he was beginning to hope that nothing serious would come of it. On the other hand, Paul Friche might be right about these aristos. There might be 40 or 50 francs to be made out of them, and in any case they had one or two things upon their persons which might be worth a few francs, and who knows, they might even have something in their pockets worth taking. This hope and thought gave Lemoine additional strength, and seeing that the aristo struggled so desperately, he thought to silence him by bringing his heavy fist with a crash upon the old man's head. "Yvonne! A moi!" shouted M. le duc, ere he fell back senseless. That awful cry, Yvonne heard it as she was being dragged through the noisome crowd. It mingled in her ear with the other awful sounds, the oaths and blasphemies which filled the air with their hideousness. It died away just as a formidable crash against the entrance door suddenly silenced every cry within. "All hands up!" came with a peremptory word of command from the doorway. "Mercy on us!" murmured the woman Lemoine, who still had Yvonne by the hand. "We are undone this time." There was a clatter and grounding of arms, a scurrying of bare feet and sabots upon the floor, the mingled sounds of men trying to fly and being caught in the act and hurled back, screams of terror from the women, one or two pitiable calls, a few shrill cries from frightened children, a few dull thuds as of human bodies falling. It was all so confused, so unspeakably horrible. Yvonne was hardly conscious. Near her some one whispered hurriedly: "Put the aristos away somewhere, maman Lemoine. The whole thing may only be a scare. The Marats may only be here about the aristos. They will probably leave you alone if you give them up. Perhaps you'll get a reward. Put them away till some of this row subsides. I'll talk to Commandant Fleury if I can." Yvonne felt her knees giving way under her. There was nothing more to hope for now, nothing. She felt herself lifted from the ground. She was too sick and faint to realise what was happening. Through the din which filled her ears, she vainly tried to distinguish her father's voice again. V. A moment or two later she found herself squatting somewhere on the ground. How she got here she did not know. Where she was she knew still less. She was in total darkness. A fusty, close smell of food and wine gave her a wretched feeling of nausea. Her head ached intolerably, her eyes were hot, her throat dry. There was a constant buzzing in her ears. The terrible sounds of fighting and screaming and cursing, The crash of broken glass and overturned benches came to her as through a partition, close by but muffled. In the immediate nearness all was silence and darkness. End of chapter 7. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 8 of Lord Tony's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines. Lord Tony's Wife by Baroness ORCZY. Chapter 8. The English Adventurers. Part 1. It was with that muffled din still ringing in her ear, and with the conception of all that was going on the other side of the partition, standing like an awesome spectre of evil before her mind, that Yvonne woke to the consciousness that her father was dead. He lay along the last half-dozen steps of a narrow wooden staircase which had its base in the narrow cupboard-like landing onto which the Lemoines had just thrust them both. Through a small heart-shaped hole cut in the door of the partition wall, a shaft of feeble light struck straight across to the foot of the stairs. It lit up the recumbent figure of the last of the Dukes de Kernogan, killed in a brawl in a house of evil fame. Weakened by starvation, by the hardships of the past few days, his constitution undermined by privations and mayhap, too, by gnawing remorse, he had succumbed to the stunning blow dealt to him by a half-drunken brute. His cry, "Yvonne! À moi!" was the last despairing call of a soul racked with remorse to the daughter whom he had so cruelly wronged. When first that feeble shaft of light had revealed to her the presence of that inert form upon the steps, she had struggled to her feet, and, dazed, had tottered up to it. Even before she had touched the face, the hands, before she had bent her ear to the half-closed mouth, and failed to catch the slightest breath, she knew the full extent of her misery. The look in the wide-open eyes did not terrify her, but they told her the truth, and since then she had cowered beside her dead father on the bottom step of the narrow stairs, her fingers tightly closed over that one hand which never would be raised against her. An unspeakable sense of horror filled her soul. The thought that he, the proud father, the haughty aristocrat, should lie like this, and in such a spot, dragged in and thrown down, no doubt by Lemoine, like a parcel of rubbish, and left here to be dragged away again and thrown again like a dog into some unhallowed ground. That thought was so horrible, so monstrous, that at first it dominated even sorrow. Then came the heart-rending sense of loneliness. Yvonne Dewhurst had endured so much these past few days that a while ago she would have affirmed that nothing could appall her in the future, but this was indeed the awful and overwhelming climax to what had already been a surfeit of misery. This, she, Yvonne, cowering beside her dead father, with no one to stand between her and any insult, any outrage which might be put upon her, with nothing now but a few laths between her and that yelling, screeching mob outside. Oh, the loneliness, the utter, utter loneliness! She kissed the inert hand, the pale forehead. With gentle, reverent fingers she tried to smooth out those lines of horror and of fear which gave such a pitiful expression to the face. Of all the wrongs which her father had done her, she never thought for a moment. It was he who had brought her to this terrible pass, he who had betrayed her into the hands of her deadliest enemy, he who had torn her from the protecting arms of her dear milor and flung her and himself at the mercy of a set of inhuman wretches who knew neither compunction nor pity. But all this she forgot as she knelt beside the lifeless form, the last thing on earth that belonged to her, the last protection to which she might have clung. Part 2. Out of the confusion of sounds which came, deadened by the intervening partition, to her ear, it was impossible to distinguish anything very clearly. All that Yvonne could do, as soon as she had in a measure collected her scattered senses, was to try and piece together the events of the last few minutes, minutes which indeed seemed like days and even years to her. Instinctively she gave to the inert hand which she held an additional tender touch. At any rate her father was out of it all. He was at rest and at peace. As for the rest, it was in God's hands. Having only herself to think of now, she ceased to care what became of her. He was out of it all, and those wretches after all could not do more than kill her. A complete numbness of senses and of mind had succeeded the feverish excitement of the past few hours. Whether hope still survived at this moment in Yvonne Dewhurst's mind it were impossible to say. Certain it is that it lay dormant, buried beneath the overwhelming misery of her loneliness. She took the fichu from her shoulders and laid it reverently over the dead man's face. She folded the hands across the breast. She could not cry, she could only pray, and that quite mechanically. The thought of her dear milor, of his clever friend, of the message which she had received in prison, of the guide who had led her to this awful place, was relegated, almost as a memory, in the furthermost cell of her brain. III. But after a while, outraged nature, still full of vitality and of youth, reasserted itself. She felt numb and cold, and struggled to her feet. From somewhere close to her a continuous current of air indicated the presence of some sort of window. Yvonne, faint with the close and sickly smell which even that current failed to disperse, felt her way all around the walls of the narrow landing. The window was in the wall between the partition and the staircase. It was small and quite low down. It was crossed with heavy iron bars. Yvonne leaned up against it, grateful for the breath of pure air. For a while yet she remained unconscious of everything save the confused din which still went on inside the tavern, and at first the sounds which came through the grated window mingled with those on the other side of the partition, but gradually, as she contrived to fill her lungs with the cold breath of heaven, it seemed as if a curtain was being slowly drawn away from her atrophied senses. Just below the window two men were speaking. She could hear them quite distinctly now, and soon one of the voices, clearer than the other, struck her ear with unmistakable familiarity. "I told Paul Friche to come out here and speak to me," Yvonne heard that same voice say. "Then he should be here," replied the other, "and if I am not mistaken." There was a pause, and then the first voice was raised again. "Halt! Is that Paul Friche?" "At your service, citizen," came in reply. "Well, is everything working smoothly inside?" "Quite smoothly, but your Englishmen are not there." "How do you know?" "Bah! I know most of the faces that are to be found inside the Rat Mort at this hour. There are no strangers among them." The voice that had sounded so familiar to Yvonne was raised now in loud and coarse laughter. "Name of a dog! I never for a moment thought that there were any Englishmen about. Citizen Chauvelin was suffering from nightmare." "It is early yet," came in response from a gentle, bland voice. "You must have patience, citizen." "Patience? Bah!" ejaculated the other roughly. "As I told you before, 'tis but little I care about your English spies. 'Tis the Kernogans I am interested in. What have you done with them, citizen?" "I got that blundering fool Lemoine to lock them up on the landing at the bottom of the stairs." "Is that safe?" "Absolutely. It has no egress save into the tap room and up the stairs to the rooms above. Your English spies if they came now would have to fly in and out of those top windows ere they could get to the aristos." "Then in Satan's name keep them there a while," urged the more gentle, insinuating voice, "until we can make sure of the English spies." "Pshaw! What foolery!" interjected the other, who appeared to be in a towering passion. "Bring them out at once, citizen Friche, bring them out, right into the middle of the rabble in the tap room. Commandant Fleury is directing the perquisition. He is taking down the names of all that cattle which he is arresting inside the premises. Let the ci devant Duc de Kernogan and his exquisite daughter figure among the vilest cutthroats of Nantes. "Citizen, let me urge on you once more," came in earnest persuasive accents from that gentle voice. "Nothing," broke in the other savagely. "To with your English spies. It is the Kernogans that I want." Yvonne, half crazed with horror, had heard the whole of this abominable conversation wherein she had not failed to recognise the voice of Martin Roget, or Pierre Adet as she now knew him to be. Who the other two men were she could easily conjecture. The soft, bland voice she had heard twice during these past few days, which had been so full of misery, of terror, and of surprise. Once she had heard it on board the ship which had taken her away from England, and once again, a few hours since, inside the narrow room which had been her prison. The third man who had subsequently arrived on the scene was that coarse and grimy creature who had seemed to be the moving evil spirit of the awful brawl in the tavern. What the conversation meant to her she could not fail to guess. Pierre Adet had by what he said made the whole of his abominable intrigue against her palpably clear. Her father had been right after all. It was Pierre Adet who through some clever trickery had lured her to this place of evil. How it was all done she could not guess. The message, the device, her walk across the street, the silence, the mysterious guide, which of these had been the trickery? Which had been concocted by her enemy? Which devised by her dear milor? Enough that the whole thing was a trap all the more hideous as she, Yvonne, who would have given her heart's blood for her beloved, was obviously the bait wherewith these friends meant to capture him and his noble chief. They knew evidently of the presence of the gallant Scarlet Pimpernel and his band of heroes here in Nantes. They seemed to expect their appearance at this abominable place tonight. She, Yvonne, was to be the decoy which was to lure to this hideous lair those noble eagles who were still out of reach. And if that was so, if indeed her beloved and his valiant friends had followed her hither, then some part of the message of hope must have come from them or from their chief, and milor and his friend must even now be somewhere close by, watching their opportunity to come to her rescue, heedless of the awful danger which lay in wait for them, ignorant mayhap of the abominable trap which had been so cunningly set for them by these astute and ferocious brutes. Yvonne, a prisoner in this narrow space, clinging to the bars of what was perhaps the most cruel prison in which she had yet been confined, bruised her hands and arms against those bars in a wild desire to get out. She longed with all her might to utter one long, loud, and piercing cry of warning to her dear milor not to come nigh her now, to fly, to run while there was yet time, and all the while she knew that if she did utter such a cry, he would hurry hot haste to her side. One moment she would have had him near, another she wished him an 100 miles away. IV. In the tap room a more ordered medley of sounds had followed on the wild pandemonium of a while ago. Brief, peremptory words of command, steady tramping of feet, loud harsh questions and subdued answers, occasionally a moan or a few words of protest quickly suppressed, came through the partition to Yvonne's straining ears. "Your name?" "Where do you live?" "Your occupation?" "That's enough. Silence." "The next." "Your name?" "Where do you live?" Men, women, and even children were being questioned, classified, packed off, God knew whither. Sometimes a child would cry, a man utter an oath, a woman shriek, then would come harsh orders delivered in a gruff voice, more swearing, the grounding of arms, and more often than not a dull, flat sound like a blow struck across human flesh, followed by a volley of curses or a cry of pain. "Your name?" "Georges Amédée Lemoine." "Where do you live?" "In this house." "Your occupation?" "I am the proprietor of the tavern, citizen. I am an honest man and a patriot. The Republic—" "That's enough." "But I protest." "Silence." "The next." All with dreary, ceaseless monotony. and Yvonne, like a trapped bird, was bruising her wings against the bars of her cage. Outside the window Chauvelin and Martin Roget were still speaking in whispers. The fowlers were still watching for their prey. The third man had apparently gone away. What went on beyond the range of her prison window, out in the darkness of the night which Yvonne's aching eyes could not pierce, she, the miserable watcher, the bait set here to catch the noble game, could not even conjecture. The window was small, and her vision was further obstructed by heavy bars. She could see nothing, hear nothing, save those two men talking in whispers. Now and again she caught a few words. "A little while longer, citizen. You lose nothing by waiting. Your Kernogans are safe enough. Paul Friche has assured you that the landing where they are now has no egress save through the tap room, and to the floor above. Wait at least until Commandant Fleury has got the crowd together, after which he will send his Marats to search the house. It won't be too late then to lay hands on your aristos, if in the meanwhile..." "'Tis futile to wait," here interrupted Martin Roget roughly. "And you are a fool, citizen, if you think that those Englishmen exist elsewhere than in your imagination." "Hark!" broke in the gentle voice abruptly, and with forceful command. And as Yvonne too, in instinctive response to that peremptory call, was further straining her every sense in order to listen, there came from somewhere, not very far away, right through the stillness of the night, a sound which caused her pulses to still their beating, and her throat to choke with the cry which rose from her breast. It was only the sound of a quaint and drawly voice saying loudly, and in English: "Egad, Tony, ain't you getting demmed sleepy?" Just for the space of 2 or 3 seconds Yvonne had remained quite still while this unexpected sound sent its dulce echo on the wings of the northwesterly blast. The next, stumbling in the dark, she had run to the stairs even while she heard Martin Roget calling loudly and excitedly to Paul Friche. One reverent pause beside her dead father, one mute prayer commending his soul to the mercy of his Maker, one agonized entreaty to God to protect her beloved and his friend, and then she ran swiftly up the winding stairs. At the top of the stairs, immediately in front of her, a door, slightly ajar, showed a feeble light through its aperture. Yvonne pushed the door further open and slipped into the room beyond. She did not pause to look round, but went straight to the window, and throwing open the rickety sash, she peeped out. For the moment she felt that she would gladly have bartered away 20 years of her life to know exactly whence had come that quaint and drawling voice. She leaned far out of the window trying to see. It gave on the side of the Rat Mort, over against Louise Adet's house. The space below seemed to her to be swarming with men. There were hurried and whispered calls. Orders were given to stand at close attention, whilst Martin Roget had apparently been questioning Paul Friche, for Yvonne heard the latter declare emphatically: "I am certain that it came either from inside the house or from the roof, and with your permission, citizen, I would like to make assurance doubly sure." Then one of the men must suddenly have caught sight of the vague silhouette leaning out of the window, for Martin Roget and Friche uttered a simultaneous cry, whilst Chauvelin said hurriedly: "You are right, citizen, something is going on inside the house." "What can we do?" queried Martin Roget excitedly. "Nothing for the moment but wait. The Englishmen are caught sure enough like rats in their holes." "Wait!" ejaculated Martin Roget with a savage oath. "Wait! Always wait, while the quarry slips through one's fingers." "It shall not slip through mine," retorted Paul Friche. "I was a steeplejack by trade in my day. It won't be the first time that I have climbed the side of a house by the gutter pipe. À moi, Jean Pierre," he added, "and may I be drowned in the Loire if between us two we do not lay those cursed English spies low." "100 francs for each of you," called Chauvelin lustily, "if you succeed." Yvonne did not think to close the window again. Vigorous shouting and laughter from below testified that that hideous creature Friche and his mate had put their project in immediate execution. She turned and ran down the stairs, feeling now like an animal at bay. By the time that she had reached the bottom, she heard a prolonged hoarse cry of triumph from below, and guessed that Paul Friche and his mate had reached the window sill. The next moment there was a crash overhead of broken window glass, and of furniture kicked from one end of the room to the other, immediately followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running helter-skelter down the stairs. Yvonne, half crazed with terror, faint and sick, fell unconscious over the body of her father. Part 5. Inside the tap room, Commandant Fleury was still at work. Your name? Where do you live? Your occupation? The low room was filled to suffocation. The walls lined with Marats, the doors and windows, which were wide open, were closely guarded, whilst in the corner of the room, huddled together like bales of rubbish, was the human cattle that had been driven together, preparatory to being sent for a trial to Paris, in vindication of Carrier's brutalities against the city. Fleury, for form's sake, made entries in a notebook. The whole thing was a mere farce. These wretched people were not likely to get a fair trial. What did the whole thing matter? Still, the commandant of the Marats went solemnly through the farce which Carrier had invented with a view to his own justification. Lemoine and his wife had protested and been silenced. Men had struggled and women had fought, some of them like wildcats, in trying to get away. Now there were only a half a dozen or so more to docket. Fleury swore, for he was tired and hot. "This place is like a pest house," he said. Just then came the sound of that lusty cry of triumph from outside, followed by all the clatter and the breaking of window glass. "What's that?" queried Fleury. The heavy footsteps running down the stairs caused him to look up from his work and to call briefly to a sergeant of the Marats who stood beside his chair. "Go and see what that sacré row is about," he commanded. "In there," he added, as he indicated the door of the landing with a jerk of the head. But before a man could reach the door, it was thrown open from within with a vigorous kick from the point of a sabot, and Paul Friche appeared under the lintel with the aristo wrench thrown over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, his thick muscular arms encircling her knees. His scarlet bonnet was cocked over one eye, his face was smeared with dirt, his breeches were torn at the knees, his shirt hung in strips from his powerful shoulders. Behind him his mate, who had climbed up the gutter pipe into the house in his wake, was tottering under the load of the ci devant Duc de Kernogan's body, which he had slung across his back, and was holding on to by the wrists. Fleury jumped to his feet. The appearance of these two men, each with his burden, caused him to frown with anger, and to demand peremptorily: "What is the meaning of this?" "The aristos," said Paul Friche curtly. "They were trying to escape." He strode into the room, carrying the unconscious form of the girl as if it were a load of feathers. He was a huge, massive looking giant. The girl's shoulders nearly touched the low ceiling as he swung forward facing the angry commandant. "How did you get into the house, and by whose orders?" demanded Fleury roughly. "Climbed in by the window, pardi," retorted the man, "and by the orders of citizen Martin Roget." "A corporal of the company Marat takes orders only from me. You should know that, citizen Friche." "Nay," interposed the sergeant quickly, "this man is not a corporal of the company Marat, citizen commandant. As for Corporal Friche, why, he was taken to the infirmary some hours ago with a cracked skull. He—" "Not Corporal Friche!" exclaimed Fleury with an oath. "Then who, in the devil's name, is this man?" "The Scarlet Pimpernel, at your service, citizen commandant," came loudly and with a merry laugh from the pseudo Friche. And before either Fleury or the sergeant or any of the Marats could even begin to realize what was happening, he had literally bounded across the room, and as he did so he knocked against the hanging lamp, which fell with a crash to the floor, scattering oil and broken glass in every direction, and by its fall plunging the place into total darkness. At once there arose a confusion and medley of terrified screams, of piercing shrieks from the women and the children, and of loud imprecations from the men. These mingled with the hasty words of command, with quick orders from Fleury and the sergeant, with the grounding of arms and the tramping of many feet, and with the fall of human bodies that happened to be in the way of the reckless adventurer and his flight. "He is through the door!" cried the men who had been there on guard. "After him, then!" shouted Fleury. "Curse you all for cowards and for fools!" The order had no need to be repeated. The confusion, though great, had only been momentary. Within a second or less, Fleury and his sergeant had fought their way through to the door, urging the men to follow. "After him, quick! He is heavily loaded." "He cannot have got far," commanded Fleury as soon as he had crossed the threshold. "Sergeant, keep order within, and on your life see that no one else escapes." Chapter 8. Recording by Deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Book 2, Chapter 9 of Lord Tony's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lord Tony's Wife by Baroness ORCZY. Book 2, Chapter 9. The Proconsul. 1. From round the angle of the house, Martin Roget and Chauvelin were already speeding along at a rapid pace. "What does it all mean?" queried the latter hastily. "The Englishman, with the wench on his back. Have you seen him?" "Malediction! What do you mean?" "Have you seen him?" reiterated Fleury hoarsely. "No." "He couldn't have passed you?" "Impossible." "Then unless some of us here have eyes like cats, that limb of Satan will get away. On to him, my men," he called once more. "Can you see him?" The darkness outside was intense. The northwesterly wind was whistling down the narrow street, drowning the sound of every distant footfall. It tore mercilessly round the men's heads, snatching the bonnets from off their heads, dragging at their loose shirts and breeches, adding to the confusion which already reigned. "He went this way!" shouted one. "No, that!" cried another. "There he is!" came finally in chorus from several lusty throats. "Just crossing the bridge!" "After him!" cried Fleury. 100 francs to the man who first lays hands on that devil!" Then the chase began. The Englishman on ahead was unmistakable with that burden on his shoulder. He had just reached the foot of the bridge, where a street lanthorn fixed on a tall bracket of the cornerstone had suddenly thrown him into bold relief. He had less than 100 meters' start of his pursuers, and with a wild cry of excitement they started in his wake. He was now in the middle of the bridge, an unmistakable figure of a giant, vaguely silhouetted against the light from the lanthorns on the further end of the bridge, seeming preternaturally tall and misshapen with that hump upon his back. From right and left, from under the doorways of the houses in the Carrefour de la Poissonnière, the Marats who had been left on guard in the street now joined in the chase. Overhead windows were thrown open. The good burghers of Nantes, awakened from their sleep, forgetful for the nonce of all their anxieties, their squalor, and their miseries, leaned out to see what this new kind of din might mean. From everywhere it almost seemed as if some sprang out of the earth, men, either of the town guard or Marats on patrol duty, or mere idlers and nighthawks who happened to be about, yielded to that primeval instinct of brutality which causes men as well as beasts to join in a pursuit against a fellow creature. Fleury was in the rear of his posse. Martin Roget and Chauvelin, walking as rapidly as they could by his side, tried to glean some information out of the commandant's breathless and scrappy narrative. What happened exactly? It was the man, Paul Friche, with the aristo wench on his back, and another man carrying the ci devant aristo. They were the English spies, in disguise. They knocked over the lamp and got away. Name of a... "No use swearing, citizen Martin Roget," retorted Fleury as hotly as his agitated movements would allow. "You and citizen Chauvelin are responsible for the affair. It was you, citizen Chauvelin, who placed Paul Friche inside that tavern in observation. You told him what to do. Well? Paul Friche, the real Paul Friche, was taken to the infirmary some hours ago, with a cracked skull, dealt him by your Englishmen, I've no doubt." "Impossible!" reiterated Chauvelin with a curse. "Impossible? Why impossible? The man I spoke to outside the buffet was not Paul Friche. He was on guard in the place with 2 other Marats. He was not Paul Friche. The others were not Marats. Then the man who was inside the tavern was not Paul Friche. Who climbed the gutter pipe? Malediction!" And the chase continued, waxing hotter every minute. The hare had gained slightly on the hounds. There were more than 100 hot on the trail by now. Having crossed the bridge, he was on the Île Feydeau, and without hesitating a moment he plunged at once into the network of narrow streets which covered the island in the rear of La Petite Hollande and the Hôtel de la Villestreux, where lodged Carrier, the representative of the people. The hounds after him had lost some ground by halting, if only for a second or two, first at the head of the bridge, then at the corners of the various streets, while they peered into the darkness to see which way had gone that fleet-footed hare. "Down this way! No, that! There he goes!" It always took a few seconds to decide, during which the man on ahead with his burden on his shoulder had time mayhap to reach the end of a street and to turn a corner, and once again to plunge into darkness and out of sight. The street lanthorns were few in this squalid corner of the city, and it was only when perforce the running hare had to cross a circle of light that the hounds were able to keep hot on the trail. "To the bridges for your lives!" now shouted Fleury to the men nearest to him. "Leave him to wander on the island. He cannot come off it unless he jumps into the Loire." The Marats, intelligent and ferociously keen on the chase, had already grasped the importance of this order. With the bridges guarded, that fleet-footed Englishman might run as much as he liked. He was bound to be run to earth like a fox in his burrow. In a moment they had dispersed among the quays, some to one bridgehead, some to another. The Englishman could not double back now, and if he had already crossed to the Ile Glorette, which was not joined to the left bank of the river by any bridge, he would be equally caught like a rat in a trap. "Unless he jumps into the Loire," reiterated Fleury triumphantly. "The proconsul will have more excitement than he hoped for," he added with a laugh. "He was looking forward to the capture of the English spy, and in deadly terror lest he escaped. But now meseems we shall run our fox down in sight of the very gates of La Villestreux." Martin Roget's thoughts ran on Yvonne and the Duc. "You will remember, citizen commandant," he contrived to say to Fleury, "that the ci devant Kernogans were found inside the Rat Mort." Fleury uttered an exclamation of rough impatience. What did anyone care at this moment for a couple of aristos more or less when the noblest game that had ever fallen to the bag of any terrorist was so near being run to earth? But Chauvelin said nothing. He walked on at a brisk pace, keeping close to Commandant Fleury's side, in the immediate wake of the pursuit. His lips were pressed tightly together, and a hissing breath came through his wide-open nostrils. His pale eyes were fixed into the darkness, and beyond it, where the most bitter enemy of the cause which he loved was fighting his last battle against fate. 2. "He cannot get off the island," Fleury had said a while ago. Well, there was of a truth little or nothing now between the hunted hare and the capture. The bridges were well guarded, the island swarming with hounds, the Marats at their posts, and the Loire an impassable barrier all around. And Chauvelin, the most tenacious enemy man ever had, Fleury keen on a reward, and Martin Roget with a private grudge to pay off, all within 200 yards behind him. True, for a moment the Englishman had disappeared. Burden and all, the gloom appeared to have swallowed him up. But there was nowhere he could go. Mayhap he had taken refuge under a doorway in one of the narrow streets, and hoped perhaps under cover of darkness to allow his pursuers to slip past him and then to double back. Fleury was laughing in the best of humours. He was gradually collecting all the Marats together, and sending them to the bridgeheads under the command of the various sergeants. Let the Englishman spend the night on the islands if he had a mind. There was a full company of Marats here to account for him as soon as he attempted to come out in the open. The idlers and the night hawks, as well as the municipal town guard, continued to run excitedly up and down the streets. Sometime there would come a lusty cry from a knot of pursuers who thought they spied the Englishman through the darkness. At others there would be a call of halt, and feverish consultation held at a street corner as to which policy to adopt. The town guard, jealous of the Marats, were pining to lay hands on the English spy for the sake of the reward. Fleury, coming across their provost, called him a fool for his pains. "My Marats will deal with the English spies, citizen," he said roughly. "He is no concern of yours." The provost demurred. An altercation might have ensued when Chauvelin's suave voice poured oil on the troubled waters. "Why not?" he said. "Let the town guard continue their search on the island, citizen commandant. The men may succeed in digging our rat out of his hole, and forcing him out into the open all the sooner. Your Marats will have him quickly enough after that." To this suggestion the provost gave a grudging assent. The reward when the English spy was caught could be fought for later on. For the nonce, he turned unceremoniously on his heel, and left Fleury cursing him for a meddlesome busybody. "As long as he and his rabble does not interfere with my Marats," growled the commandant. "Will you see your sergeants, citizen?" queried Chauvelin tentatively. "They will have to keep very much on the alert, and will require constant prodding to their vigilance. If I can be of any service—" "No," retorted Fleury curtly. "You and citizen Martin Roget had best try and see the proconsul, and tell him what we have done. He'll be half wild with terror when he hears that the English spy is at large upon the island. You must pacify him as best you can. Tell him I have a score of Marats at every bridgehead, and I am looking personally to every arrangement. There is no escape for the devil possible, save by drowning himself and the wench in the Loire. 3. Chauvelin and Martin Roget turned from the quay onto the Petite Hollande, the great open ground with its converging row of trees which ends at the very apex of the Ile Feydeau. Opposite to them, at the further corner of the Place, was the Hôtel de la Vistro. One or two of the windows in the hotel were lighted from within. No doubt the proconsul was awake, trembling in the remotest angle of his lair, with the spectre of assassination rampant before him, aroused by the continued disturbance of the night, by the feverishness of this man-hunt carried on almost at his gates. Even through the darkness it was easy to perceive groups of people either rushing backwards or forwards on the Place, or congregating in groups under the trees. Excitement was in the air. It could be felt and heard right through the soughing of the northwesterly wind which caused the bare branches of the trees to groan and to crackle, and the dead leaves, which still hung on the twigs, to fly wildly through the night. In the centre of the Place, two small lights, gleaming like eyes in the midst of the gloom, betrayed the presence of the proconsul's coach, which stood there as always, ready to take him away to a place of safety, away from the city where he was mortally hated and dreaded, whenever the spectre of terror became more insistent than usual, and drove him hence out of his stronghold. The horses were pawing the frozen ground and champing their bits, the steam from their nostrils caught the rays of the carriage lights, which also lit up with a feeble flicker the vague outline of the coachman on his box, and the postilion rigid in his saddle. The citizens of Nantes were never tired of gaping at the carriage, a huge C-spring barouche, at the coachman's fine caped coat of bottle green cloth, and at the horses with their handsome harness set off with heavy brass bosses. They never tired of bandying words with the successive coachmen as they mounted their box and gathered up the reins, or with the postilions who loved to crack their whips and to appear smart and well groomed, in the midst of the squalor which reigned in the terror-stricken city. They were the guardians of the mighty proconsul. On their skill, quickness, and presence of mind might depend his precious life. Even when the shadow of death hangs over an entire community, there will be some who will stand and gape and crack jokes at an uncommon sight. And now, when the pall of night hung over the abode of the man-tiger and his lair, and, wrapped in its embrace, the hunted and the hunters, there still was a knot of people standing round the carriage, between it and the hotel, gazing with lack-lustre eyes on the costly appurtenances wherein the representative of wretched people loved to surround himself. They could only see the solid mass of the carriage and of the horses, but they could hear the coachman clicking with his tongue, and the postilion cracking his whip, and these sights broke the absolute dreary monotony of their lives. It was from behind this knot of gaffers that there rose gradually a tumult as of a man calling out in wrath and lashing himself into a fury. Chauvelin and Martin Roget were just then crossing La Petite Hollande from one bank of the river to the other. They were walking rapidly towards the hotel, when they heard the tumult which presently culminated in a hoarse cry and a volley of oaths. My coach, at once! Lalouette, don't leave me! Curse you all for a set of cowardly oaths! My coach, I say!" "The proconsul," murmured Chauvelin as he hastened forward, Martin Roget following closely on his heels. By the time that they had come close enough to the coach to distinguish vaguely in the gloom what was going on, people came rushing to the same spot from end to end of the Place. In a moment there was quite a crowd round the carriage, and the two men had much ado to push their way through by a vigorous play of the elbows. "Citizen Carrier!" cried Chauvelin at the top of his voice, trying to dominate the hubbub. "1 minute! I have excellent news for you! The English spy!" "Curse you for a set of blundering fools!" came with a husky cry from out the darkness. "You have let that English devil escape! I knew it! I knew it! The assassin is at large! The murderer! My coach at once! My coach! Lalouette! Do not leave me!" Chauvelin had by this time succeeded in pushing his way to the forefront of the crowd. Martin Roget, tall and powerful, had effectually made a way for him. Through the dense gloom he could see the misshapen form of the proconsul, wildly gesticulating with one arm, and with the other clinging convulsively to young Lalouette, who already had his hand on the handle of the carriage door. With a quick, resolute gesture, Chauvelin stepped between the door and the advancing proconsul. "Citizen Carrier," he said with calm determination, "on my oath there is no cause for alarm. Your life is absolutely safe. I entreat you to return to your lodgings." To emphasize his words he had stretched out a hand and firmly grasped the proconsul's coat sleeve. This gesture, however, instead of pacifying the apparently terror-stricken maniac, seemed to have the effect of further exasperating his insensate fear. With a loud oath he tore himself free from Chauvelin's grasp. "10,000 devils!" he cried hoarsely. "Who is this fool who dares to interfere with me? Stand aside, man! Stand aside, or—" And before Chauvelin could utter another word, or Martin Roget come to his colleague's rescue, there came the sudden sharp report of a pistol. The horses reared, the crowd was scattered in every direction. Chauvelin was knocked over by a smart blow on the head, whilst a vigorous drag on his shoulder alone saved him from falling under the wheels of the coach. Whilst confusion was at its highest, the carriage door was closed to with a bang, and there was a loud commanding cry hurled through the window of the coachman at the box. "En avant, citizen coachman! Strive for your life! Through the Savannah gate! The English assassins are on our heels!" The postilion cracked his whip. The horses, maddened by the report, and by the pushing, jostling crowd, and the confused cries and screams around, plunged forward, wild with excitement. Their hoofs clattered on the hard road. Some of the crowd ran after the coach across the Place, shouting lustily, "The proconsul! The proconsul!" Chauvelin, dazed and bruised, was picked up by Martin Roget. "The cowardly brute!" was all he said between his teeth. "He shall rue this outrage as soon as I can give my mind to his affairs. In the meantime—" The clatter of the horses' hoofs was already dying down in the distance. For a few seconds longer the rattle of the coach was still accompanied by the cries of "The proconsul! The proconsul!" Fleury, at the bridgehead, seeing and hearing its approach, had only just time to order his Marats to stand at attention. A salvo should have been fired when the representative of the people, the high and mighty proconsul, was abroad, but there was no time for that, and the coach clattered over the bridge at breakneck speed, whilst Carrier, with his head out of the window, was hurling anathemas and insults at Fleury for having allowed the paid spies of that cursed British government to threaten the life of a representative of the people. "I go to Savigny," he shouted just at the last, "until that assassin has been thrown in the Loire. But when I return, look to yourself, Commandant Fleury." Then the carriage turned down the Quai de la Fosse, and a few minutes later was swallowed up by the gloom. 4. Chauvelin, supported by Martin Roget, was hobbling back across the Place. The crowd was still standing about, vaguely wondering why it had got so excited over the departure of the proconsul and the rattle of a coach and pair across the bridge, when on the island there was still an assassin at large, an English spy, the capture of whom would be one of the great events in the chronicles of the city of Nantes. "I think," said Martin Roget, "that we may as well go to bed now, and leave the rest to Commandant Fleury. The Englishman may not be captured for some hours, and I, for one, am over fatigued." "Then go to bed as you desire, citizen Martin Roget," retorted Chauvelin dryly. "I, for one, will stay here until I see the Englishman in the hands of Commandant Fleury." "Hark!" interposed Martin Roget abruptly. "What was that?" Chauvelin had paused even before Martin Roget's restraining hand had rested on his arm. He stood still in the middle of the Place, and his knees shook under him so that he nearly fell prone to the ground. "What is that?" reiterated Martin Roget with vague puzzlement. "It sounds like young Lalouette's voice." Chauvelin said nothing. He had forgotten his bruises. He no longer hobbled. He ran across the Place to the front of the hotel whence the voice had come which was so like that of young Lalouette. The youngster, it was undoubtedly he, was standing at the angle of the hotel. Above him a lanthorn threw a dim circle of light on his bare head with its mass of dark curls, and on a small knot of idlers with 2 or 3 of the town guards among them. The first words spoken by him which Chauvelin distinguished quite clearly were, "You are all mad, or else drunk. The citizen proconsul is upstairs in his room. He has just sent me down to hear what news there is of the English spies." 5. No one made reply. It seemed as if some giant and spectral hand had passed over this mass of people, and with its magic touch had stilled their turbulent passions, silenced their imprecations, and cooled their ardor, and left naught but a vague fear, a subtle sense of awe, as when something unexplainable and supernatural has manifested itself before the eyes of men. From far away, the roll of coach wheels rapidly disappearing in the distance alone broke the silence of the night. "Is there no one here who will explain what this means?" queried young Lalouette, who alone had remained self-assured and calm, for he alone knew nothing of what had happened. "Citizen Fleury, are you there?" Then, as once again he received no reply, he added peremptorily, "Hey, someone out there! Are you all loafs and oafs that not one of you can speak?" A timid voice from the rear ventured on explanation. "The citizen proconsul was here a moment ago. We all saw him, and you, citizen Lalouette, were with him." An imprecation from young Lalouette silenced the timid voice for the nonce, and then another resumed the halting narrative. "We all could have sworn that we saw you, citizen Lalouette. Also the citizen proconsul. He got into his coach with you. That is, they have driven off." "There is some awful and treacherous hoax," cried the youngster now in a towering passion. "The citizen proconsul is upstairs in bed, I tell you, and I have only just come out of the hotel. Name of a dog! Am I standing here or am I not?" Then suddenly he bethought himself of the many events of the day which had culminated in this gigantic feat of legerdemain. "Chauvelin!" he exclaimed. "Where in the name of hell is citizen Chauvelin?" but Chauvelin for the moment could nowhere be found. Dazed, half unconscious, wholly distraught, he had fled from the scene of his discomfiture as fast as his trembling knees would allow. Carrier searched the city for him high and low, and for days afterwards the soldiers of the Commandant Marat gave aristos and rebels a rest. They were on the lookout for a small wizened figure of a man with the pale keen eyes who had failed to recognize in the pseudo Paul Friche, in the dirty out at elbow sans culottes, the most exquisite dandy that had ever graced the salons of Bath and of London. They were searching for the man with the acute and sensitive brain who had failed to scent in the pseudo Carrier and the pseudo Lalouette his old and arch enemy, Sir Percy Blakeney, and the charming wife of my Lord Anthony Dewhurst. End of Book 2, Chapter 9. Recording by Todd. Book 2, Chapter 10 of Lord Tony's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lord Tony's Wife by Baroness ORCZY. Book 2, Chapter 10. Lord Tony. 1. A quarter of an hour later, Citizen Commandant Fleury was at last ushered into the presence of the proconsul, and received upon his truly innocent head the full torrent of the despot's wrath. But Martin Roget had listened to the counsels of prudence. For obvious reasons he desired to avoid any personal contact for the moment with Carrier, whom fear for the English spies had made into a more abject and more craven tyrant than ever before. At the same time, he thought it wisest to try and pacify the brute by sending him the 10,000 francs, the bribe agreed upon for his help in the undertaking which had culminated in such a disastrous failure. At the self-same hour whilst Carrier, fuming and swearing, was for the 100th time uttering the furious "How?" which for the 100th time had remained unanswered, two men were taking leave of one another at the small postern gate which gives on the cemetery of St. Anne. The taller and younger of the two had just dropped a heavy purse into the hand of the other. The latter stooped and kissed the kindly hand. "Milor," he said, "I swear to you most solemnly that Monsieur le Duc de Kernogan will rest in peace in hallowed ground. Monsieur le Curé de Vertou, ah, he is a saint and a brave man, milor, comes over whenever he can prudently do so, and reads the offices for the dead, over those who have died as Christians. And there is a piece of consecrated ground out here in the open, which those fiends of the Terrorists have not discovered yet." "And you will bury Monsieur le Duc immediately?" admonished the younger man, "and apprise Monsieur le Curé of what has happened?" "Aye, I'll do that, milor, within the hour. Though Monsieur le Duc was never a very kind master to me in the past, I cannot forget that I served him and his family for over 30 years as coachman. I drove Mademoiselle Yvonne in the first pony cart she ever possessed. I drove her. Ah, that was a bitter day. Her and Monsieur le Duc when they left Kernogan, never to return. I drove Mademoiselle Yvonne on that memorable night when a crowd of miserable peasants attacked her coach, and that brute Pierre Adet started to lead a rabble against the chateau. That was the beginning of things, milor. God alone knows what has happened to Pierre Adet. His father Jean was hanged by order of Monsieur le Duc. Now Monsieur le Duc is destined to lie in a forgotten grave. I serve this abominable republic by digging graves for their victims. I would be happier, I think, if I knew what had become of Mademoiselle Yvonne." "Mademoiselle Yvonne is my wife, old friend," said the younger man softly. "Please God, she has years of happiness before her, if I succeed in making her forget all that she has suffered." "Amen to that, milor," rejoined the man fervently. "And I pray you tell the noble lady to rest assured, Jean Marie, her old coachman whom she used to trust implicitly in the past, will see that Monsieur le Duc de Kernogan is buried as a gentleman and a Christian should be." "You are not running too great a risk by this, I hope, my dear Jean Marie," quoth Lord Tony gently. "No greater risk, milor," replied Jean Marie earnestly, "than the one which you ran by carrying my old master's dead body on your shoulders through the streets of Nantes." "Bah!
"That was simple enough," said the younger man. "The hue and cry is after higher quarry to-night. Pray God the hounds have not run the noble game to earth." Even as he spoke, there came from far away through the darkness the sound of a fast-trotting pair of horses, and the rumble of coach-wheels on the unpaved road. "There they are, thank God!" exclaimed Lord Tony, and the tremor in his voice alone betrayed the torturing anxiety which he had been enduring ever since he had seen the last both of his adored young wife and of his gallant chief in the squalid tap-room of the Rat Mort. With the dead body of Yvonne's father on his back, he had quietly worked his way out of the tavern in the wake of his chief. He had his orders, and for the members of that gallant League of the Scarlet Pimpernel there was no such word as disobedience, and no such word as fail. Through the darkness and through the tortuous streets of Nantes, Lord Anthony Dewhurst, the young and wealthy exquisite, the hero of 100 fêtes and galas in Bath, in London, staggered under the weight of a burden imposed upon him only by his loyalty and a noble sense of self-prescribed discipline, and that burden the dead body of the man who had done him an unforgivable wrong. Without a thought of revolt he had obeyed, and risked his life and worse in the obedience. The darkness of the night was his faithful handmaiden, and the excitement of the chase after the other quarry had fortunately drawn every possible enemy from his track. He had set his teeth and accomplished his task, and even the deathly anxiety for the wife whom he idolized had been crushed under the iron heel of a grim resolve. Now his work was done, and from far away he heard the rattle of the coach-wheels which were bringing his beloved nearer and nearer to him. 5 minutes longer and the coach came to a halt. A cheery voice called out gaily, "Tony, are you there?" "Percy!" exclaimed the young man. Already he knew that all was well. The gallant leader, the loyal and loving friend, had taxed every resource of a boundlessly fertile brain in order to win yet another wreath of immortal laurels for the league which he commanded, and the very tone of his merry voice proclaimed the triumph which had crowned his daring scheme. The next moment Yvonne lay in the arms of her dear milor. He had stepped into the carriage, even while Sir Percy climbed nimbly on the box and took the reins from the bewildered coachman's hands. "Citizen proconsul!" murmured the latter, who of a truth thought that he was dreaming. "Get off the box, you old noodle!" quoth the pseudo-proconsul peremptorily. "Thou and thy friend the postilion will remain here in the road, and on the morrow you'll explain to whosoever it may concern that the English spy made a murderous attack on you both and left you half dead outside the postern gate of the cemetery of St. Anne. Here," he added as he threw a purse down to the two men, who, half dazed and overcome by superstitious fear, had indeed scrambled down, one from his box, the other from his horse, "there's 100 francs for each of you in there, and mind you drink to the health of the English spy and the confusion of your brutish proconsul." There was no time to lose. The horses, still very fresh, were fretting to start. "Where do we pick up Hastings and Ffoulkes?" asked Sir Percy Blakeney finally, as he turned towards the interior of the barouche, the hood of which hid its occupants from view. "At the corner of the Rue de Guégan," came the quick answer. "It is only 200 metres from the city gate. They are on the lookout for you." "Ffoulkes shall be postilion," rejoined Sir Percy with a laugh, "and Hastings sit beside me on the box. And you will see how at the city gate and all along the route soldiers of the guard will salute the equipage of the all-powerful proconsul of Nantes. By gad," he added under his breath, "I've never had a merrier time in all my life, not even when—" He clicked his tongue and gave the horses their heads, and soon the coachman and the postilion, and Jean-Marie the gravedigger of the cemetery of St. Anne, were left gaping out into the night in the direction where the barouche had so quickly disappeared. "Now for La Croisic and the Day Dream," sighed the daring adventurer contentedly. "And for Marguerite," he added wistfully. 2. Under the hood of the barouche, Yvonne, wearied but immeasurably happy, was doing her best to answer all her dear milor's impassioned questions, and to give him a fairly clear account of that terrible chase and flight through the streets of the Ile Ferdue. "Oh, milor! How can I tell you what I felt when I realized that I was being carried along in the arms of the valiant Scarlet Pimpernel? A word from him, and I understood. After that I tried to be both resourceful and brave. When the chase after us was at its hottest, we slipped into a ruined and deserted house. In a room at the back there were several bundles of what looked like old clothes. "'Tis in my storehouse," milor said to me. "Now that we have reached it, we can just make long noses at the whole pack of bloodhounds." He made me slip into some boy's clothes which he gave me, and whilst I donned these he disappeared. When he returned I truly did not recognize him. He looked horrible, And his voice! After a moment or two he laughed, and then I knew him. He explained to me the role which I was to play, and I did my best to obey him in everything. But oh! I hardly lived while we once more emerged into the open street and turned into the great place, which was full, oh, full of people. I felt that at every moment we might be suspected. Figure to yourself, my dear milor. What Yvonne Dewhurst was about to say next will never be recorded. My Lord Tony had closed her lips with a kiss. End of Book 2, Chapter 10. Recording by Todd. End of Lord Tony's Wife by Baroness ORCZY.